is Rethinking Identities in Contemporary Pakistani Fiction, Beyond 9/11 by Aroosa Kanwal. The speakers are Aroosa Kanwal, Muneeza Shamsie, and Shehryar Fazli as moderator. Shehryar Fazli is the senior analyst and South Asia regional editor for the International Crisis Group, an independent Brussels-based non-profit organization focused on resolving deadly conflicts. He is the author of the novel Invitation, which was a bestseller in India and Pakistan on its release in January 2011 and was runner-up for the 2011 Edinburgh International Book Festival's award for a first book. Shehryar, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be moderating this session with Aroosa and Muneeza. By way of a very quick introduction, Aroosa Kanwal is Assistant Professor in English Literature at the International Islamic University, Islamabad, Pakistan. She teaches Pakistani literature in English, post-colonial theory and literature, literary theory, modern drama, literary criticism, and modern poetry. She received her PhD from Lancaster University, UK. Her current research interests include diasporic writings, politics of representation, questions of migration, borders, identity, and resistance in post-colonial literatures, in particular South Asia. And she's just recently produced this book that we'll be talking about this evening, Rethinking Identities in Contemporary Pakistani Fiction, post 9/11. Muneeza Shamsie doesn't really need an introduction, but very quickly I'll do one. She's a writer, a critic, a bibliographer, and the author most recently of Hybrid Tapestries, the development of Pakistani literature in English. And she's the managing editor for Work in Progress, the Oxford companion to the Literatures of Pakistan. She also serves on several advisory committees, including that of the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature, of which she was a jury member in 2013. She was the regional chairperson for Europe and South Asia of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize from 2009 to 2011. Her extensive work includes 3 pioneering anthologies of Pakistani English literature, and she is a regular contributor to Dawn and Newsline. I'm honored to be moderating this conversation with them. And what I'd like to do to start off, Aroosa, is just if you could introduce your book and talk about what inspired it, what motivated you, and perhaps most interestingly, what is it about the time now that makes this book very important to do now?
Thank you so much, Shehryar. Well, if I just say that what motivated me to write this book, basically, that I became interested in this topic, because of this sudden boom of what is generally termed as 9/11 fiction, which kind of reinforced the public rhetoric in the US, which equates Islam with terrorism. And interestingly, this wasn't a trend in fiction merely. I think post 9/11 American theater, film, and even some of the BBC dramas, they stereotype Muslims and Islam, going even to the extent of featuring child suicide bomber storylines. So it was basically in response to these neo-Orientalist tropes of the Muslim culture and Muslim identity that another genre emerged, which later, came to be termed as post 9/11 fiction, which basically, foregrounded the lives of the Muslims affected by 9/11. So my book basically examines the way second-generation writers of Pakistani origin confront these negative international attitudes towards Muslim and Islam. Because, these negative attitudes toward Muslims, because of, all that Islamophobia debate has continued to sort of shape, Western attitude and, imagination in such a way that the figure of a Muslim, became a metaphor for barbarism and violence. And, sort of that Muslimness became synonymous with terror. So I was, basically interested in these different perspectives on Islam and Muslim identities after 9/11 and their links to the regional, local and global politics and the scenario. And in addition to this, I think I was very much interested in a question, which interests most of my second generation writers, that what does it mean to be a Muslim in a 9/11 world? As Kamila Shamsie, also talks about that, it's hard to be a Muslim in a post 9/11 world and be not aware of Muslimness. So yeah, I mean, for example, when we talk about 9/11 event and the post 9/11 event, Islam became a key conceptual category to reframe Muslim identity, and we all are aware of this fact that this identitarian binaries that was very much a phenomena of post 9/11 world, where we have this good Muslim and the bad Muslim, and then we have an Islamic absolutist and the moderate Muslim. But again, this term, moderate Muslim is again very problematic, because ultimately it is the Islamic absolutist whose voice is considered to be authentic in the post 9/11 world. So yeah, I mean, I think I was very much interested in, in situating this figure of a terrorist, or extend the debate surrounding the figure of terrorist, in relation to, or by giving, historical contextualization to the current negotiations of the national, Muslim, and then the diaspora identities. And that is why, my book basically, comes up, or I set up, the two, different categories of these second generation writings, which probably I'll talk about later. But for example, that, there's a major genre produced by second generation writer, which can be termed as post 9/11 fiction. And then there is a subgenre which doesn't talk about 9/11 as such, but which basically uses pre 9/11 setting to situate, Pakistan, contemporary Pakistan, in a global scenario. Because as we all know, that the last decade was, a boom of Pakistani literature, and it was predominantly post 9/11 fiction which was getting attention, I would say, from the Western readers. So, and which led some of the commentators to say that, that this fire and the drama that this second generation writing or this genre created, it would soon fizzle out, or it would burn out quickly, which I felt was a very hasty conclusion on their part, because there were many mainstream writers within Pakistan and in the diaspora who were not writing about 9/11 as such. For example, we have Muhammad Hanif and Uzma Aslam Khan, Daniel Muhyiddin, Kasra Shehryar. They were rather interested in indigenous problems such as, honor killings, blasphemy law, Islamization of Pakistan, in the 1970s, forced marriages, minority rights, etc., etc. So, but all these problems, I agree that they have contributed in one way or another, directly or indirectly, to the stereotyping of Muslims in the West. And because of this, I just felt that it was impossible to read post 9/11 fiction in isolation. So there was a strong need to sort of historically contextualize the current negotiations of Muslim and diaspora identities, and of course, the Islam's troubled relationship with the West. And that actually led me to come up with two major categories, in my book. So there was a major category, as I just said, that was termed as post 9/11 fiction, which actually use post 9/11 settings in order to talk about the ways in which the 9/11 terrorist attacks have affected the lives of Muslims in the diaspora particularly, and at home too. But then there is another category, a subgenre, which I term as retrospective prologues to post 9/11 fiction. Now, why I call them, retrospective prologues to 9/11 fiction, because, these novels, they use pre-9/11 settings, in order to situate contemporary Pakistan in a wider global perspective. And for example, the novels such as Kamala Shamsie's Cartography or, Uzma Aslam Khan's The Geometry of God, or Nadeem Aslam's The Seasons of the Rainbird, because all these writers, they actually talk about all these indigenous problems that have been sort of, responsible, directly or indirectly towards a negative image of the Muslims or Muslim, they've contributed to this debate surrounding, Islamic extremism, the rise of Islamic extremism, terrorist activities within Pakistan, jihadism, etc., etc. So yeah, and then of course the major focus has also been, for example, on Zia's regime and all the political decisions, taken during Zia's time. For example, the establishment of madrasas, and then Islamization of Pakistani society in general, the educational policies, our involvement in the Afghan jihad, then influx of Afghan mujahideen. I mean, all these things, they have contributed in one way or another towards the problems that we are facing in Pakistan today, and particularly in Karachi.
Yeah, and the Zia-ul-Haq era figures quite prominently in this book, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. But before I do, I just wanted to ask you, I think we're all quite familiar with the shape of the debate in sort of the mainstream press. But as an academic and a critic, and I want to ask both of you this question, what's the health of literary criticism? Are you sort of a lone voice here? Where do you place yourself? And before you answer, I also want to ask Muneeza, you've worked in the field of criticism for a long time. would be interested to hear where you place Aroosa's book in the line of work that you've looked at your whole career.
I was very excited by her book because, as far as I know, there's a lot of writing. There's a category now which is Muslim writing. There may be one or two on Pakistani writing, but the most books that come, you get covered as part of the whole thing. What is happening? It hasn't come from Pakistan. We've now got, and Pakistani English literature for a long time wasn't actually even taught in academia, but now it is, and now you've got academics publishing articles in very well-known literary journals. But as far as I know, Aroosa's book is the first by an academic working in Pakistan to tackle a critical subject like this, to do a critical work on this line. And 9/11, of course, is something that is constantly being discussed. In fact, I've been working on a history of Pakistani literature in English, and what I find is there's a great paucity of material for a whole lot of books, but the ones dealing with 9/11, you have article after article after article, and those books, all they're written, I'm not, some of them are extremely good, but the point is that when you're writing from something from the outside, you're looking at it from a kind of cerebral way. When you're writing from the inside, you're looking at it both cerebrally and from the point of view of a living culture, and it really is immensely important that we develop our own critical work. And I don't mean that in the terms of being paranoid or saying, oh, well, we're being persecuted. I mean, it's not about that. It's about you show your society as it is, but you also look at the realities. You also look at things that a foreign academic might miss or might have to struggle very hard to come to terms with it. And that's why I thought her book was so important. And of course, it is beautifully argued. I mean, the way she develops her arguments through what she calls the first generation, the way she posits the 1980s. Now, in the West, when they talk about the 9/11 novel, 9/11 books, nobody really talks about 1980s, which is how we perceive it really all began. She looks at the writers who've dealt with 1980. She looks at the perceptions of the press, of how the Western press and, the Western press present, and the kind of stories they pick up. And sometimes they even, there's been a spoof on it by Maha Khan Phillips on how they even create sort of a story, situation will be a good story. And she develops this argument, then she develops it onto post 9/11 identities, which is the title of this book, of what she focuses on Nadeem Aslam, Kamla Shamsie, and Uzma Aslam Khan, and how they bring in the whole, not only history, but also the cultural commingling of history, the history and nationality and mankind is not monolithic. We're all the result of migration, of change, of encounter with different cultures, of intermarriage with different communities. And she looks at this entire history, this gives history a geopolitical looks, and then looks at the geopolitical identities that these writers have or are striving to assert.
The concept of sort of, writing after so much has been written by the West about us reminds me a little bit of, W.E. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, where the African American is looking at himself or herself in two ways. One is as herself, the other is how the white person views her or him, and what kind of how that then affects their behavior, and in the case of African American writers, their writing. You mentioned Maha Khan Phillips. I thought an interesting moment in your book when you're talking about her totally aware of that Western eye and sort of playing with it by exaggerating the stereotype. And it's a very subversive moment in her book, beautiful from this angle. Can we hear a little bit more from you on your discussion about this?
I think Maha Philip Khan's, it's kind of an experimental book, as you know. What she's trying to do here is that, she's trying to sort of deconstruct that neo-Orientalist trends within the Muslim writings, from the writings that are coming from the Muslim writers, or what we can also term as the indigenous writings. So, this concept, and what happens is that, that there are certain writers, and of course, one category which is, for example, which tends to sort of perpetuate, these neo-Orientalist tropes of the Muslim woman is the Muslim women memory memoirs. If you just read all these books, and the title covers or the title pages with the burqa-clad woman and all that kind of stuff. So, and this is an idea which actually, Maha Phillips Khan is trying to deconstruct in her book. And second very interesting thing which she is criticizing and which she is satirizing is that, this tendency to homogenize the Muslim cultures and Muslim societies, because you just can't, because even if you just talk about the Muslim world in general, you just can't say that, the Arab world is the same as the subcontinent, or the Muslims in the subcontinent they're the same as the Muslims of the Middle East. So there is a strong need to highlight the complexity embedded in the Islam that is being practiced in different cultures. And similarly, she actually criticizes, this homogeneous or monolithic representation of the Muslim woman too, that where all women are shown to be, under subjection, and they are shown to be oppressive, by the patriarchal societies and the patriarchal structures. I mean, I do not want to say, and I'm not saying that, that the women in Pakistan or women in the Muslim cultures are not subjected or they are not oppressed or something like that. But the point is that not all women in our society are. And then there's a very interesting thing, that there's, one of the characters, has been stereotyped in the novel. She is the one who is subjected and who is suppressed or who is objectified, by her own women. For example, the girls who are, the three friends who are working, for an NGO, and they make a movie based on the honor killing and all that kind of a stuff. So, so this is a concept which she is criticizing, that we need to sort of highlight the complexities involved in not only women's agency, but in women's subjection as well. Women are suppressed at various levels, but then they are agentic at various levels too. So there is a strong need to sort of highlight this complexity, this heterogeneity, which is the characteristic of, I think, our societies or Muslim culture in general.
Question to both of you. Are there any risks that accompany this awareness that you are trying to break down stereotypes, risks of falling to, I don't want to call it propaganda as such, but self-censorship, that look, we're getting a pretty bad rap, we need to put our best foot forward, starting with you, Muneeza.
Well, there is well, I'm not sure to what extent the danger comes from the novelists themselves. The danger comes from the Pakistani readership, who seems to think that the English language novel is a kind of ministry of information from the outside world. And they get very indignant if if an Urdu writer writes certain things that are very negative about our society, we're likely to praise that our writer's boldness and courage. But if a English language writer does the same, often the flack is that you're presenting a bad image of the country to the rest of the world. It's your responsibility to present an image of the country. I don't know to what extent this affects the writers. I mean, if they're really a writer worth their salt, they write the book, you look at your structure, you look at your plot. I don't know, actually it's quite an interesting question. What do you feel in relation to Nadim's work, for example, which...
That, I don't know, that somehow reminds me again of the same thing, that's something related to the burden of representation. As I said, that I don't know, for us, whether or not a writer claims to bear this burden of representation, but that is voluntarily assumed. But I do feel that things have changed after 9/11, and the writers, the Pakistani writers, they do take upon themselves this burden of representation, as this is very evident from their interviews and from their polemical nonfiction. I mean, for example, if you talk about Nadeem Aslam and Shamsie, I think they do feel, they do have, this strong obligation to use their position to write for the Western reader, or to set something right for the Western reader when it comes to Muslim-related issues, or let's say subcontinent in particular. And the interesting thing is that, basically, and this is something, which is, what they're trying to do is that, and which is different from the journalism, or generally the media, is that, this journalism or the media has this tendency to sort of, propagandize the things. And I am actually talking about the post-9/11 context, in which the media propaganda has stereotyped Muslims and the Muslim identities in general. Now, which actually reminds us of this, kind of existence of an ethno-normative space, which allows the viewer to sort of, recognize the ambiguity and the ambivalence embedded in a discourse, instead of accepting things, instead of simply accepting, let's say, the predetermined ideological positions. Now, this ethno-normative space is there in a fiction, because writers, they try to give us an alternative positions, and they discuss problems with alternate positions, or with unfamiliar positions. Or they provide us with this this space, this in-betweenness, which allows us sort of, think about the other possibilities too, which was not there, for example, in journalism or in the media discourses. But in the post-9/11 fiction, I think we do have this in-betweenness. And I mean, for example, Mohsen Hamid's reluctant fundamentalist. Now, Hamid basically turns the whole concept of fundamentalism topsy-turvy, and he gives us a new definition of fundamentalism in his novel, which was before, which was associated with Islam or Muslimness, and then fundamentalism was looked upon in terms of U.S. capitalistic economy. So, so I think they need to sort of, provide this kind of, productive in-betweenness, which is not there.
Yeah, please.
Related to that, I just wondered, when you say that they're presenting a different view, how different is this to the origins of a lot of South Asian writing, especially modern South Asian writing pre-partition? It began with questioning the colonial narrative, finding an alternative space. Is there a parallel? Is there a difference? Do you have an opinion on this?
With reference to these writers?
Well, originally South Asian writing in the early 20th century was to challenge the narratives of empire, to present the South Asian point of view. Is there a parallel between what is happening now with the 9/11 novel, or is it a different movement?
And can I just add to the question? You talk about journalism, and there's a very compelling quote that you have from a couple of scholars who talk about journalism sort of devolving into entertainment because of the commercial pressures. And it seems like that opens up this big gap.
Yeah.
And it's a gap that novelists could potentially fill, and it's exactly the reverse of what happened in the US with the rise of new journalism, which came at a time when these journalists felt that American fiction writers were no longer taking on public issues, and they exploited that gap. Here it seems that it's in reverse, that the novelist now has a role to play, and just curious about what, does this impose certain demands on the kind of novelist that you're expected to be as a Pakistani writer, or the novel that you're expected to write as a Pakistani writer?
I think after 9/11, for example, Aslam has never defined himself as a Muslim writer or even a Pakistani writer. He's always sort of, consider himself a British writer. And we know that he's an atheist, and he's an avowed atheist instead. But after 9/11, he started identifying himself as a Muslim writer. So again, yes, I do feel that after 9/11, they do feel compelled to sort of, tell people that yes, Muslims are like this as well. So they are writing about, the Muslims. But of course, there's another thing which is very important, that why do they identify themselves, as Muslims? Because it is affecting the lives of the Muslims in the diaspora too. So they feel, yes, to me, they do feel compelled to write about it. But talking about their Muslimness or their Muslim identity, as you say that how they're different. Yes, they are definitely, because they're definitely challenging what we call, this clash of civilization rhetoric, and that was my main argument in my book, that why these writers sort of tend to affiliate themselves, or why their characters affiliate themselves to this very notion of Muslim Ummah, because it's a non-territorial kind of, a concept of Muslim identity where, you don't believe in the borders and these notions of belongingness. So you move from nationalism to transnationalism, and from transnationalism to the post-nationalism too. So which means that you tend to sort of affiliate yourself with a more flexible notion of identity, and you show this tendency in your protagonist where they can connect with other cultures, where they can connect with the others, at home and in the diaspora. So yes, I do feel that was a trend in almost like all the writers, particularly when you talk about Shamsie, for example, Shamsie's Burnt Shadows or Shamsie's Cartography, which deals with this concept of otherness at both the levels. So she felt compelled to sort of, take on this responsibility to show, that how the Muslims, they have this tendency to connect with others as well, or, to be more cosmopolitan, to be more at home in the unfamiliar or situations, or the strange situations.
Related to what we're talking about here, the Greek philosopher Novalis had a wonderful quote. He said that the novel grows out of the shortcomings of history, which I think is a wonderful quote that summarizes much of what we're talking about here. I wanted to come back to your concept of the prologue, sort of a retrospective prologue to 9/11 written post 9/11. Last night I just turned on the TV and there was this movie on The Walk, which is about Philip Petit's walk in 1974, where he tightropes across the Twin Towers. And there was a novel that came out, an American novel that came out a couple of years ago, set in New York, that centers on this moment. And it's a very big novel in the sense that it's got a big cast of characters. And then at one point, at the same time, all these diverse characters are all looking at the Twin Towers because there's a man walking between them. And even though he's writing about 1974, no matter what, it is a post 9/11 moment in the sense that New York, the entire city, is united by what's happening at the Twin Towers. And the image in the book, there's a photograph in the book which is chilling because it's a real photograph of this guy doing this walk, and there's a plane behind him, and it just, gives me the chills every time I read it or look at the image. But it seems in New York, that's the place where the attack happened.
Yeah.
When you're talking about writing that comes out of the, Pakistani experience, it's a sense of where the attacks came from. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit your idea of the retrospective prologue to 9/11, maybe with reference to specific novels that you've looked at.
Yeah. For example, as I said, that these are called retrospective prologues because they give us an historical contextualization to these debates surrounding the figure of the terrorist or jihadism or Islamic terrorism. So I was interested in tracing the roots of current jihadism or the rise of extremism, not only in Pakistan, but the wider subcontinent and, the Middle East. And that is why I have tried to sort of establish these links between different events and different kinds of, extremisms that was, for example, emerging since 1970. For example, as I said, that, when we talk about Zia's regime and the rise of madrasas and our participation in Afghan jihad, I think the Talibanization of Pakistan, which is basically a very recent phenomena, that is linked to that specific moment in the history. So, and then again, if you just look at the other policy initiatives during Zia's regime, I think he, in certain ways, I don't know, I just feel that this Sunni Shia crisis, the ethnic and sectarian conflicts within Pakistan, the conflict between Punjabis and Sindhis and Pathans, all these things, they are the product of Zia's regime. And all these have contributed in one way or the other towards the rise of extremism in Pakistan. You can see, for example, the way, these Shia-Sunni crises, they have roiled, different parts of the country. So I was not only interested in something which was happening in Pakistan, but then something which was happening in Afghanistan. And then what is the connection between Shia-Sunni conflicts within Pakistan and then how they are linked to the Shia-Sunni crisis, for example, in Iraq? And what is its connection to Saudi Arabia? So, and that is why something which is very peculiar about, Uzma Khan is that she's probably the only writer who has talked about the Gulf War. No other Pakistani writer has actually talked about the Gulf War and its relevance to Pakistan and the rise of extremism in Pakistan, in the contemporary Pakistan. So I have tried to sort of, knit together all these indigenous political scenario and the social problems that have been. And then, of course, in addition to that, not only, I think I've talked about, for example, the linguistic differences, I've talked about the ancestral identities, and then, all that, the local and the immigrant, conflicts within Pakistan. In one way or the other, I think these have, and cartography, for example, talks all about, these conflicts, for example, where the 1980s Karachi has been juxtaposed with 1971, and how these wars and how these ethnic and sectarian conflicts, they have affected the human relationships. So it's, and that is actually the moment where we say that the personal identities, they are blurred with the public identities, or the individual identities are blurred with the collective identities. So, and so all these things, they have in one way or the other contributed towards the rise of extremism in the 21st century Pakistan.
Want to jump in with anything? Otherwise, I can. Well, I wanted to ask again a question to both of you about your life as critics, and you've, as I said in the beginning, been in this game for quite a while. Do we hear about the novels that are coming out? Is there a parallel of appropriate size and rigor body of critical work emerging? We're probably a bit less familiar than you are, but that's one part. But the other is, if you could say just a few words about the importance of critical work and criticism.
Well, there is a growing body of critical work in Pakistan. And elsewhere, I had said earlier, it was about criticism. The point is this, I've come into this through journalism. I used to do, or I still do, book reviews. The difference between book reviews and a wider critical work, which we haven't developed very much, is it places that novel. I mean, we just review a book, I think, but if you do a critical work, you're placing it in a larger context. You're placing it in the context of 1980 novels, or like 9/11 and its relationship to 1980. Often I find very random comments in reviews. Sometimes somebody writes about a servant being exploited, or a relationship between the owner of a house and the servant boy, and the comment was, oh, it's obviously taken from Khalid Hosseini's Kite Runner. Well, that is actually missing the point of the book, because the book was about the fact that the servant boy was a Bengali boy with no home, who had come after 1971. So when you get a review, you see what you need is to put that work in a bigger context, and that is how you develop a proper critical tradition. Actually, it was the great George Steiner who once said that a writer writes a book, but we as critics build an architecture around it. Of course, sometimes we demolish the architecture also because critical traditions change. So what was the accepted critical norm becomes challenged. But that is part of the discourse, that is part of the intellectual challenge. And for particularly academics and students, you need that discipline to really understand a work, I think, in its entirety.
Yeah, well, for me, of course, I think, as you've said, that yes, I mean, there was a lot that was written on post 9/11, but I think all the responses to the Islamophobia debates, or these rise of extremism, or terrorism, etc., that was coming from the West. I mean, you just pick up any book, any article is written by the Western, critic, or a researcher, or an academic. So I was actually interested in the way, that these second generation writers of Pakistani origin were writing back to the dominant discourses. But important thing for me was to sort of, these, what we can call the voices from within. There was no critical response. There was no, critical book which came from this part of the world. And that was also important because they were looking at it from the point of, 9/11. 9/11 as an important marker for all these critical debates that were going on, or the public discussion, or the discourses that were going on, in the US and in the Western world. So for me, the kind of problems that we as as Pakistanis or as Pakistani Muslims can look at. For example, these kind of connections between, for example, 1947 and 1971, 1980s, and then how they are connected to the Gulf War and how they are connected to this Afghan jihad, which was again, we participated in Afghan jihad, under the paradigm of affiliation with the Muslim Ummah, basically. So all these connections, I think, the way we can understand and we can highlight and foreground, that cannot be grasped, I think, in entirety by a Western reader or a Western critic.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. And it seems to me that, although we're producing a great body of work, I think it's the role of critical works to make those books speak to each other. And that's when you can start talking about a national literature. Are you serious? Oh, wow, I'm sorry, I thought that we had a lot more time than we did. All right, well, in that case, let me not take up more time asking questions on my own. Why don't we open this up to the audience? By the way, excuse me, have we accounted for the fact that we started late? Okay, no, it's just, we started a bit late, so I thought we'd go on for a while, but please, why don't you ask your question?
Okay, thank you very much for this enlightening talk. Though we have read Dr. Aroosa's book already, but it was really an enlightening session for us, and we have been enlightened on many different areas. My question for Dr. Aroosa is, in terms of her status as a critic, Pakistani creative writers after 9/11, they of course tried to come up with their own apologies for the Muslim identities, and they presented the Muslim characters in the way they were supposed to in terms of what was happening in post 9/11 times. Sometimes it was kind of reclamation of culture, sometimes it was an apology for their identities. After all that, Dr. Aroosa, as a critic, you tried to define their, creative, efforts to define their identities in terms of critical theory, and you sort of picked them from the liminal cultural spaces and you dropped them again at the same place, because you did not come up with any finite, placement for those identities. Since you have been advocating about this interstitial placement of the characters, my question is, are you a critic that in Bhabha's terms are white but not quite, or what he calls authorized version of otherness? So where do you place yourself as the emerging Pakistani critic who is picking the characters from Pakistani novels from interstitial spaces and leaving them at the same place?
Okay, I don't think that all the works that I have taken, or let's take the example of Uzma Aslam Khan's novels, and I am, full of praise for her, because she is not the one who is actually writing about 9/11, or she is not apologetic about her Muslimness, and she is not trying to place her characters in the same way as the other writers are doing, like Shamsie, or, for example, Nadeem Aslam, or any other writer. So she actually talks about the indigenous character within the indigenous, settings, where we assert our Pakistaniness. And we do give this indigenous response to the 9/11, discourses. it's not that, that you're being defensive about your Pakistaniness or you're being defensive about your Muslimness all the time, but it's just that you use your position to set something right. I mean, for example, being a critic as well, I think my position or my role or my job is to provide, more possibilities, to conjure myriad possibilities for the Western reader so they can reconsider or rethink their assertions or their assumptions about Muslims or Islam or even Pakistan. And by linking all these problems, indigenous problems, that is this local and global nexus is meant to basically, to give Western reader more possibility to ponder upon their own assumptions, as I said, about Islam or the Muslimness. So this is, I think, it's just a kind of a, giving them more options to think about, giving them diverse perspective, alternative perspectives, or unfamiliar positions from where they can think about, these contemporary issues.
Thank you so much. Do you think that the body of writers right now who are writing in post 9/11 scenario, they really take up the issues the way it was taken, or it is still taken by Native Americans? Because for me, I think that they have taken tackled the issues of their identities as well as their representation in the academia, in the literary, circles, in a very, very, what we can say is, with a force, with a bang, let's say, with a force or with a bang, or the African American body of writers. They had written it in the 1960s, 70s, and so on and so forth. But do you think that Pakistani literature and Pakistani writers, they are coming up to that level, or it is about only, that identity is more like assimilating into the globalization? What do you say to that?
I'm not sure if I've got your question right. Do you want to say that whether they are stagnant or they have...
No, it's not about the stagnation. I'm not talking about stagnation. I'm saying that do you think that they need to come up with more issues, the writers?
I think, anyone who is familiar with, I think you're actually talking about the same thing, that, that if you just look at Pakistani Anglophone writings, I don't see it as a, stagnant literary tradition or canon. If you just go back to the first generation writers, they had, they wrote about partition, they wrote about post-independence problems, and now they are taking up issues more recently, for example, minority rights and, all that human right debates, environmentalism, ecofeminism or eco-environmentalism, this cosmopolitanism. So all these issues, they are taken up by the writers, so we just can't say that they have taken up only the issues related to identity.
Hold on,
Look at, for example, Uzma Aslam Khan's writing in The Thinner Than Skin. She does deal with this concept of eco-cosmopolitanism, eco-environmentalism, where man's relationship with the environment and how they sort of assert their cosmopolitanism through their relationship with the nature. So yeah, I do feel that there's a whole bulk of writing that is experimenting with the new ideas.
Muneeza?
Well, I was saying it's not really entirely the 9/11 novel. I mean, Pakistani English literature is very, very widespread, or it's a very wide field. And you've got, for example, it is seldom given any cognizance, but you've really got writers in Britain, for example. It began with Hanif Qureshi, but they write about the societies in which they live, and they are, incidentally, very strongly influenced by Afro-American writing. And you have people like Hanif, you have people like a poet like John Siddiq, you have Tariq Mahmood. There's a number of writers who are writing about working class lives, about working class Britons whose lives were very harsh, whose parents' lives were often very harsh in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, we keep banging on about this being an anglicized exercise, which it is no longer so, because with the addition of diaspora, you have got people who are writing in English because that is the only language they have. And they're writing different experiences, often, to the anglicized elite. The other thing is that we talk a lot about the 9/11 novel, but we have given very little cognizance to the fact that in the last 10 or 15 years, there have been a large number of 1971 novels looking at what caused us to lose half a country, which most of our country and our officialdom preferred to believe that doesn't exist or didn't happen. So there is it's a very wide field, and there's a lot of very interesting work coming up.
Excuse me, please. Please, last only one. You'll excuse me for the question I'm going to put after a while. I have to congratulate you for the wonderful work you have done at such a young age, and the area you have ventured to get into. Well, my question, I'll straight away request my colleague sitting here to please excuse me for this question. But there is one thinking about 9/11, that Americans engineered these 9/11s themselves.
Yeah.
What do you think?
This is one of the major argument of my book, that I, consider U.S.-American policy as the major form of terrorism. I think it says everything.
Just to add one thing that you talk about in your book, you discuss Faryal Gohar's book, No Space for Further Burials, where this American Firangi is a character in Afghanistan, and it seems at that moment that the differences between a Western identity and or an American identity and an Afghan identity break down. So I thought that was...
Yes, that is, exactly. As I said, because I was focusing on the diverse, perspectives on these, 9/11 narratives. But, for example, if you just talk about reluctant fundamentalists, that is all about, that is U.S. foreign policy and the U.S., initiatives and U.S. interference in the Muslim world or in the indigenous Muslim world. That is highly criticized by most of the writers. And of course, the U.S., for example, just look at the way, we are still, facing the repercussions of 9/11, the drone attacks in the northwestern region of Pakistan. So it is a kind of terrorism. And in fact, America has been termed as a big terrorist in the world. And this is actually one of the main arguments of my book, too.
Is there a gap there in American literature? I mean, the big fact about American power...
Yeah, I think, the thing is that, I think this post 9/11 fiction, which is coming from the Muslim world, and I'm using the Muslim world in order to represent the broader category, not just the fiction coming from Pakistan and India, but also from the other parts of the Arab world. I think that is a response to these dominant discourses. So most of, I don't tend to homogenize, all Western media or all Western literature, but mainstream, yes. Media tend to sort of stereotype Islam and Muslims.
Ma'am, my question is that when we look at Pakistani post 9/11 Pakistani fiction in English, there's always this issue with it that it's more mediatory, it's negotiating between the East and the West, and it somehow gets co-opted by Western epistemic discourses. Do you think that the criticism that we're subjecting this specific category of literature to, don't you think it also faces a threat of being co-opted by Western epistemic paradigms? Do you think there's a way out for us to exceed that kind of a discursive enclosure?
I think so, because not all the Pakistani literature, fall into that category. For example, I was talking about Faryal Gahar's, novel, and particularly Maha Philip Khan's novel, where she does criticize. She is very critical of this whole concept of, the literature which was produced even by the Muslim world under the influence of the first world paradigm. So she does kind of subvert or deconstruct this concept of the first world gaze. So not all the literature, I would say, and this is particularly specific about Uzma Aslam Khan's novels, where she is extremely critical about the U.S. foreign policy, and her writings are not informed by the first world paradigms. And I think this is a kind of a debate that we need to sort of look into the more indigenous theories and the theoretical paradigms in order to situate and position our literature rather than, looking for the first world paradigms.
I think we'll take two more questions, gentlemen over there, and well, I'd like to hear from somebody new as well. Can somebody get a mic to the gentleman over there? No, excuse me. The gentleman in the white shirt back there, please.
Talking about identities, I would like to know how Pakistani is Nadeem Aslam, having been born in England, brought up in England, living in England, yet writing about Pakistan occasionally. So how Pakistani is he? That's one. Two, does the book also look at literatures produced in regional languages post 9/11 in Pakistan?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
The second...
Does your book also address literatures produced in regional languages of Pakistan
non-English speaking.
No,
post 9/11?
No, my focus has been predominantly on Pakistani, second generation Pakistani Anglophone fiction. I do not even consider the poetry. But as far as your question regarding Aslam, that who's brought up, of course, was born in Pakistan, but brought up in in Britain. He identifies himself as Muslim, I think, in a broader category. There is, for example, whether you're a Muslim by practice or whether you're a Muslim by culture or civilization. So he calls himself, a cultural Muslim. And I do have problems, in terms of his representation of Pakistani characters or representation of Islam. I think I have been very critical about some of Aslam's representation of Islam and the Muslim characters in his writing because of his own limited or ignorant knowledge, I think, about Islam. I don't know whether I have time. I have time to sort of go into the detail. But,
we've been told to finish up. So do you want to say a final word?
I just wanted to add, not about Nadeem. Actually, he was born in Gujranwala, and he lived in Pakistan till he was 14. And his first language was Urdu. His father was a literary figure, and his friends included people like Habib Jalib. So, in that sense, Nadeem does have a kind of rootedness. Now, there are other things, of course, that have changed since he's left. And he actually says he had to work extremely hard to learn good English when he went to England. So there is that link. It's not, the person who's British born is Hanif Qureshi. That's different.
yeah,
Well, thank you so much, Aroosa, for your wonderful book. Thank you for Muneeza for also being part of this panel. Thank you all, and onward we go.
Thank you.